Not in my name, not in my faith, not in my words, not in that way. Not in my name, not in my faith, not in my words, not in that way.
Peace and blessings of God be with you, viewers, and welcome to another edition of A Muslim's Perspective. First, we say praise belongs to Allah. We praise Him and we ask Him for guidance and forgiveness. And we seek protection in Allah from the malice of our own souls and the evil of our actions. Whom Allah guides, no one can lead him astray, and whom He makes astray, no one can lead him back to the right path. I bear witness that there is no other deity but Allah by Himself, no associate to Him, and I bear witness that Muhammad is His servant and messenger. Our guest today is Justice for All Canada, Representative Brother Taha Ghayyur. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Taha.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me again.
Brother Taha, by that word again, meant that we have had him on several times before to speak to us about the work of Justice for All Canada. And might I remind our viewers, Brother Taha has a lifetime of involvement in the community in various positions. And when I grow up, I'd like to be like him, inshallah. If I were to name a few, he Vice President of Song Vision Foundation, Executive Director of Justice for All Canada, host of Canada Today Show on Muslim Network TV, former Executive Director of ISNA Canada, board member, and former chairperson of Muslim Fest, former media spokesperson for 3 non-profit organizations, and a whole slew of other community involvements. Now, we are in the month of Ramadan, and Ramadan is meant to teach us many lessons. The voluntary abstention from taking nourishment, quenching thirst, increasing our acts of devotion and worship, giving charity, or to sensitize those engaged in it, that being disciplined, understanding that self-centeredness is not sustainable, but being compassionate and kind to others are essential to improving the experience of being human. Ramadan provides many opportunities to be in and bond with community, to establish a society based on caring for the well-being of all, and not merely to fulfill in a mechanical way the rituals of the month. Despite these moral, spiritual, and altruistic purposes of the activities of Ramadan that Muslims are engaged in, and all the other principles we as Muslims practice, many nations and groups view our presence as a threat. When faith is experienced as ideology, those who seek to gain and maintain power are prone to oppress the faithful, given that a faithful heart is bound to a time and a creator beyond the reach of any earthly trappings. There are societies today in which Muslims are unable to exercise the right to worship freely, or to even exist, or even to live. Genocide is taking place. This, whether Muslims live in majorities or as minorities. Brother Taha, Justice for All produced a report on the fact that Islamophobia leads to the persecution and genocide of Muslim minorities. Can you give our viewers a briefing on the necessity of producing such a report?
Yes, thank you so much for highlighting this particular report, which is something that was released just about a week ago in Canada, and also by our head office in the United States. This report was actually released officially 2 days ago, in fact, at the Parliament, where our team members, including the author of this report, Brother Aiden Alexio, and our colleague Saliha Farouk, our government relations manager, was there briefing the members of parliament, senators, and their staffers on this particular report. And the necessity or the trigger for this report aligned with the commemoration of the first ever International Day of of countering Islamophobia that has been recognized by United Nations. And our thought was that the most appropriate thing on this day would be to actually release a report, which is supposed to be March 15th, by the way, to release a report on the impact the impact of Islamophobia on global minorities that are being persecuted. And sadly, even though this has been happening for over 20 plus years under the pretext of war on terror, and all sorts of phenomena that we have seen that have resulted in either mass evictions or mass displacement or mass murders of Muslim minorities around the world, there has been little effort done by human rights experts or legal community to connect the global Islamophobia to genocide, which of course is a legal term and has very serious implications for the perpetrators and of course those who are suffering.
How do you define Islamophobia?
Well, Islamophobia essentially is an irrational fear of anything Muslim or anything Islam. That's basically what it is. It is an irrational fear of anything that is remotely connected to Muslims. And what it basically assumes is that Islam and Muslims are foreign to the land that they're part of, or they have been, indigenous people of, essentially. It otherizes them. It polarizes the community, the society, into Muslims versus, everybody else, citizens versus Muslims, for instance, or foreigners in some cases, and it leads to discriminatory policies. It leads to discriminatory laws that lead to otherizing of Muslims, othering of Muslims, and eventually, and sadly, in many contexts, as we know, for instance, from this particular report, the case of, say, 4 contexts that we know of, it leads to genocide or beginning of a genocide.
What, if any, underlying causes does your report suggest generates Islamophobia?
Interestingly, of course, if you look at Islamophobia in any context, even look at Islamophobia in Canada or around the world, where, of course, we're not talking about genocide, but we are talking about some serious issues and crimes that have been a result of Islamophobia and that impacts Muslims every day. We know that it's a multifaceted problem. We know that it's a multi-layered issue. And so, it doesn't just start in some small echo chamber, or it doesn't necessarily, it's not just necessarily a one-way thing that actually impacts, a Muslim community or in specifically. It has a ripple effect. It starts, it starts, say, by some influential people in specific circles. Let's say media, for instance, is a very specific area. But you have politicians, you have experts who are, like, for instance, specifically experts on economy, who are coming up with all sorts of theories related to the involvement of Muslims, for instance, in economy, and why we should actually not have Muslims, for instance, in those spaces. It has a very deep ripple effect that impacts Muslims in all spheres of life, and of course in all aspects of community. So in the context of this report, in the context of a genocide, it is definitely a state-sponsored and a state-level working. it is definitely something that starts at the top, and it's really those policy level discriminatory practices that lead to eventual genocide of any minority community that actually faces it, and in particular, we're talking about Muslims here.
You know, the thing about it is that there are many societies, and recently we saw the extremism of ISIS and so on, and the hijacking basically of our faith, as was described by a famous quote. How can we address the misunderstanding of the essence of our faith to combat this?
Yeah, I mean, as far as Muslims are concerned, we need to ensure that we stand for justice no matter what. Whether it's against us, it's for us, it does not matter. This is what we do, even though our work, our organization is called Justice for All. Our focus is on Muslim minorities in particular, because that's an area that has been neglected by the world and by the Muslim world, by the Western world. So many of these spaces where genocides have happened, even they have never received a recognition, or even where genocide may be happening, or maybe it may be leading to genocide, like India, there's hardly any recognition. That's our focus. That being said, we always stand for in solidarity with any community that is being persecuted and facing genocide. And this is what Muslims should be all about. When God tells us in the Quran that all the prophets, not just Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon, all the prophets, Jesus, Moses, before that Adam, Noah, Isaac, all of these amazing prophets of God, they were sent with books, with signs, with a balance to do one thing, and that was to لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, to establish qist, to establish justice. This is a universal principle, and in fact a command. It's not a choice, and it's something that Muslims need to really be reminded of and need to stand firm on, especially in the month of Ramadan, when we are told that our primary purpose of Ramadan, or fasting in particular, is to develop God consciousness and restraint and taqwa. Justice is a very central part of taqwa, which is something that we rarely talk about. So as Muslims, we need to go back to our core teachings, number one, fundamental teachings that are often forgotten. And number two, as a community, we need to start talking about justice and qist and adl on a daily and a regular basis, on a weekly basis, in our sermons, in our community circles and programs and halaqas, because it's something that is often ignored. It's a heavy topic. I understand it's not a fun topic to talk about, but it is such a critical need of our time. And the last thing I'll say is that we as a community should call out all forms of injustices, whether it's happening in Pakistan or in Yemen or in Syria or in Afghanistan or in Palestine, Syria, whatever it may be, or if it's impacting Muslim minorities. So whether it's Muslim majority countries or Muslim minorities, we should be calling out injustices anywhere, because only then will we be truthful to our faith and to our spiritual teachings, but also only then will we be taken seriously when we are asking the world to stand up for justice and to defend the rights of especially Muslim minorities that are being persecuted and that are facing genocides under other regimes out there.
Well, we seem to be seeing a receding of the human rights ecosphere that existed post-World War II. And now you have governments in power that are passing laws which are, anti-freedom of worship and so on and so forth, and then demand that the citizenry follow the law of the land. So you're making it illegal for people to practice faith. And how do we reconcile this? How do you resist this sort of withdrawal of, normal, natural freedom to worship as you see fit?
We need to call on the international community to its international commitments to prevent genocide. We need to call on United Nations and all large countries, of course, powerful countries out there that have influence, G7, G20, and any country that actually has influence over others, specifically when it comes to dealing with the issue of genocide or persecution of minorities. We need to remind them of Genocide Convention, of which majority of the countries in the world are actually signatories of, and remind them of their international duty to prevent and protect any communities and prevent genocide, and also protect the human rights of communities. We need to remind and educate our communities and especially our own policymakers about Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we often forget, very basic, fundamental human rights that everybody has the right to. Of course, we cannot control everything that happens around the world, but we can control what happens in our own backyard. We can control the influence that we can have and we do have over our own MPs and our own politicians and policymakers. And that's what we're trying to do here. Sadly, we cannot control what the dictators out there do. Sadly, we can't control what other regimes can do necessarily directly, but we can definitely control the narrative that we can create right here in Canada, right here in the United States, to influence public opinion, to influence our politicians and policymakers.
Indeed, and a report like this should go a long way to at least create, at the minimum, awareness of some of the ground realities in the specific areas that the report dealt with. Which countries were dealt with in this report?
Yes, so we are talking about India, of course, more recently, what is happening in India. We are talking about the minorities in particular, Muslim, Christian, Dalits, Adivasis, and Sikhs, for instance. That's one country. Another country being the Central African Republic, which most people have never heard of, but it's happened there about 9 years back. And then we have Myanmar or Burma, and last but not least, we have China, of course, in the context of its persecution of Uyghur minorities. And these are the four contexts we're looking at. Out of these four, three, of course, have already carried out genocide at some level, and it, based on the criteria of Genocide Watch, led by Professor Gregory Stenton. There are different levels at which all these four countries actually stand when it comes to the level of genocide that is taking place or about to take place in the context of India. So yeah, that's basically, these are the four specific contexts we're talking about.
Would you give us an executive summary, so to speak, of what your report's findings are in respect of each country, one by one, as time would permit?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I can do justice to it, but of course, I would definitely want to start with Burma and what has happened to Rohingya. Of course, according to our report, actually, before I get into the report, I think it's important to establish what the Genocide Convention is all about and what is its definition of what genocide. This is a convention that was established after World War II by the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, and huge number of countries, of course, signed on to this, including Canada and the US. So it is our obligation to ensure that we actually establish it. And so there are 5 things that Genocide Convention actually talks about when it comes to the definition of genocide. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So basically, some form of destruction of the community in whole or in part. And number 4 being imposing measures intended to prevent births of the groups and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And so if you look at in any context, you're going to find majority, if not at least most of these, if not all, majority of these actually have applied. So that is the official definition of genocide convention. Then there is stages of genocide, which has been, as I mentioned, has been developed by Dr. Gregory Stanton, used by Genocide Watch. Genocide Watch is an organization that actually foresees and calls out and forecasts genocide usually way ahead of time. He's the one who had predicted the Rwanda genocide 5 years ahead before it happened. He's the one who also actually had a genocide emergency warning issued again when the Central African Republic genocide was about to take place. And he also is now predicting, over a year ago, he's been calling, he's been asking the world to actually pay attention to what's happening in India. There are 2 alerts already issued against India, and the world, of course, is silent. So according to him, there are 10 stages, and I'll just mention those 10 stages just so that we understand what we're talking about here. And it starts with the lowest stage. The first one being classification, classification of us versus them. Number 2 is symbolization. Number 3 is discrimination. Number 4 is dehumanization, which is something we have seen all across. Number 5 is organization. When you're planning for a genocide, you are having conventions against genocide, for genocide, as we have seen in India, for instance, recently. Polarization, which basically is spreading propaganda against to incite to incite basically hate against minority groups. And then 7 is polarization, which is spreading, propaganda, officially spreading propaganda of all sorts. And the preparation is to indoctrinate the fear against the victim group. Number 8 is persecution, the actual persecution, which is pretty much happened everywhere. And number 9 is extermination, which is something that we have actually seen specifically in the context of Rohingya and in the context of Central Africa or African Republic. And the last one is denial. Denial is something that pretty much all governments do after or even while it is taking place. They justify it, like for instance, in the case of Chinese government, CCP justifies concentration camps that have at least 1 million to 3 million Uyghurs in them doing forced labor and being persecuted. They justified those as vocational camps, as re-education camps, and they of course never would admit that these are actual concentration camps or internment camps. So that being said, if you look at the case of Rohingya, in the case of Rohingya or in Burma specifically, we have seen all forms of hate rhetoric that came about, and we saw all sorts of it started over we're talking about like 60, 70 years ago with hate rhetoric in that context, but it progressed to a level where at least 3 levels of genocide, 3 levels of genocide watch that we have just talked about applied, meaning stage 3, which is discrimination. We have seen actual persecution, and then of course we also saw the extermination of Rohingya people. So for instance, it started in the case of Rohingya, it started with them being called foreigners, or sometimes they were called Bengalis or Kalar, which means basically the darker skinned people, that they don't belong there. They're not ancestral. While this was the ancestral land, they were called foreigners. And in 1980s is when basically the military government passed laws that actually essentially stripped them of their citizenship, 80s and then 90s. And once you become have no citizenship anymore of the land, you become stateless, and you are at the mercy of the perpetrators who are going to do whatever they want to do. And that's when we saw about 10 years ago, sadly, literally mobs of extremists, uh, uh, Buddhist groups within Burma, who started carrying out mass evictions, attacks on villages, putting them on fire, raping, pillaging of individuals. Especially when it became extreme in 2017, and that's when the world saw almost over a million, or at least 600, 700,000 Rohingya actually fleeing. Many of them passed away, died, drowned while trying to flee. Many of them got killed in forests. So that's an extreme example, and a very serious example of how quickly, even though it brewed over a period of 60 to 70 years, technically the process started 60 to 70 years ago, but how quickly it ended up in extermination. Central Africa is the second example that I'll quickly mention, because this is a story of. Yes, go ahead, please.
We'll take a short break, and then
Yeah.
we'll continue with Central African Republic. Until we come back, viewers, peace out.
Not in my faith, not in my words, not in that way.
Brother Taha, before you continue on with Central African Republic, in terms of the Rohingyas, it seems that there is no relief for this group of people. They're in Bangladesh. I saw recently where their camps were flooded, and then there was a lot of fires that destroyed a lot of their temporary homes. And we also have now discrimination against them in India, where they also fled. Who is, what have these people done to deserve this sort of punishment? It's absolutely gut-wrenching.
Absolutely, extremely tragic. If you think about it, they have suffered so much in Myanmar, and they're still suffering in the camps, in Rohingya camps, of course, in Bangladesh. There is no education, essentially, for 500,000 kids and youth who are actually really just rotting away, essentially, with so much hope and so much potential and so much that they can do with their future. But unfortunately, they have no means of educating themselves or being educated, because the Bangladesh government does not want them to be integrated and educated in those camps. And then, as you mentioned, there are issues of violence sometimes there, but more importantly, there have been lots of flooding. There's lots of fires lately that have really impacted already very, very vulnerable community. And world is silent, and Canada has not done anything over the past 6-7 years for the Rohingya people. So yes, Canada was the first in the world to call it a genocide and gave $330 million in aid initially, and recognized what's happening to them was really a textbook case of genocide. But since then, we have not done anything, and that's one of our new campaigns that we're going to be focusing on, which is to bring Rohingya refugees to Canada, just like we have done for Uyghurs very recently. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front, but you're right, it is really, really unfortunate that we have really abandoned this community.
On to Central African Republic. What's the situation there?
Well, Central African Republic is such a tragic story, again, considering how fast the genocide took place there, and the world had turned a blind eye until even considering that Desmond Tutu of South Africa was the only world leader who actually called the attention to what was happening to Muslims in Central Africa, but world was silent. We saw a similar blind eye, that was at a time when, for instance, after pretty much all the destruction had happened, when the U.S. representative of the United Nations mentioned that over 400, pretty much all 400 something plus mosques were actually destroyed over a period of few days in Central Africa. Our team had spoken and was in contact with one of the last surviving imams in one of the last surviving masjids at the time, who was taking refuge in that masjid at the time. So, it was really, really heart-wrenching. I remember literally headlines coming out of Central Africa or African Republic of for instance, and a photo of a sword-wielding soldier, or actually a mob person who was just really driven by hate of Muslims. And the headline was, I ate a Muslim today. And he actually had his sword filled with blood, showcasing what he had actually done that day. So it was really, really brutal. It was really, really ugly. And something that, again, the world has never spoken about and doesn't care about, and something that we need to learn from, because once again, we failed, a population of Muslims just because we were not aware of, just because the world didn't care about, just because media did not pay attention to, and as an ummah, we were sleeping.
Subhanallah. May Allah grant each one of those who are victims of this, eternal bliss in the Akhirah. And the situation in China, it's Ramadan. It's tragic when you see that they can't even fast.
Yes, absolutely. I've had non-Uyghur individuals who told me, for instance, not just Uyghurs, but non-Uyghurs who were in Xinjiang province doing business, who told me how horrific and, in fact, how depressing it is to be in East Turkestan, which we call East Turkestan or Xinjiang, the province, when in the month of Ramadan in particular, where there is already mass surveillance, but there's heightened mass surveillance, especially late at night and early morning, when you have officers, you have all sorts of spies, essentially, patrolling Muslim homes, essentially, to see any sign of observant of fasting, observant of Ramadan, people praying at night, or turning the light on at early morning to pray, to do suhoor, or to also essentially to make sure that you are not, of course, fasting during the day, and they ensure that you actually are forced to eat during day, and so on. So this is something that, of course, very systemic that we have seen. But we have seen in the case of China, again, pretty much all levels of genocide apply to what has happened in China. But it has been a slow genocide, as we are aware, and it's extremely heart-wrenching seeing what has happened, considering that, for instance, there are over 50 reasons that could actually land you in a concentration camp. So obvious things like any sign of spirituality is one, but it could be anything. You receiving a text message, you receiving a WhatsApp message, or whatever message it may be, whatever applications that are being allowed, where that may have an Islamic content. You may have nothing to do with it. You hear saying salam or listening to recitation of Quran. I mean, it's not even an option. That being said, we know what has happened. It happens in concentration camps itself. Concentration camps, since Nazi Germany, this is the first time ever the world has witnessed these kind of concentration camps. Over 1 million, they say up to 3 million Muslims are in those concentration camps, where they are forced to do, basically they're doing forced labor, making all sorts of products that you and I are enjoying made by big corporate giant labels, Nike, Apple, whatever you want to, you name it, Adidas, and everything in between. Considering that 20% of world's cotton and comes from China, and considering that 84% of that cotton comes from that region, we know direct forced labor is involved of Uyghur Muslims in those camps. We know that there's forced organ harvesting, where their livers or their kidneys are being taken out for what they call halal organ sale, and government making money off of it. We know that there is forced sterilization of Muslim Uyghur women happening there. There's mass rapes happening there. So many survivors who are now out of those camps, both in North America and, of course, around the world, have talked about what they have witnessed in those camps. So this is a complete extermination, an attempt to exterminate a Muslim population, and it fits all the five definitions, pieces of definition by genocide convention as well, including over 500,000 children who have been separated by the Chinese government into what they call orphan homes or orphan camps, and plus there is the forced marriages that have been taking place between Han Chinese and Uyghur women, while Uyghur men are in concentration camps. So this is just sadly a very quick summary of all the things that constitute various levels of genocide when it comes to China causing this, perpetrating this towards Uyghur minorities and even other Turkic minorities, but specifically Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan.
Yeah, I wonder where are all these feminists when they only see issues with wearing the hijab, but they don't see issues with women being forced into marriages, that they basically have no interest in the men. It's very, very tragic. You can't even have a prayer mat in your house. You can be sent to that concentration camp. You can't have a Quran. You can't have any symbols of being Muslims whatsoever in your home. And cameras are stationed that they can track your every single movement. Really, really tragic in China. And now, can you give us some of the latest out of India?
Yeah, I mean, what we call, according to, of course, this report as well, but I mean, what we know, India is genocide in the making. That's the best way to put it, to be honest. That's the only way to put it. That it is something that we have seen so much of, and the world is basically at this point in the world basically is ignoring it only because of economic interests. Canada and United States don't want to say a word at this point, don't want to stand up to the BJP government's constant human rights violations, mainly because they need a counterweight to China, and hence their desire to actually continue doing business as usual. And this is what, of course, we are calling the Canadian government to ensure that we continue doing business as usual. India is the only country currently that has two alerts, or genocide watch alerts, essentially issued against it by Genocide Watch. And one particularly related to the situation in Kashmir, the constant militarization and constant brutalization and humanization of Kashmiri people, and then, of course, the other being Assam, the state of Assam, the most populated state in India with Muslim population, specifically where there is an experiment of state level policy discrimination happening around citizenship. So India is has been there has been state level, state sponsored hate for the past several decades, of course, going on there. But under the Modi government, especially starting with the Gujarat pogroms or riots, as they call them, under Modi administration in the state of Gujarat almost 20 plus years ago. We see a dramatic increase in genocidal policies, essentially, that are going to lead, God forbid, to all out genocide. What we know about a year and a half ago, there was a convention that took place. Let's imagine there was a convention or conference taking place led by Hindutva leaders, members of RSS on stage, members of even BJP on stage, watched by millions of Facebook viewers, live streamed, and the leaders on that stage, not just once, multiple of those conventions, calling for open mass killing and extermination of Muslims in India, of 220 million Muslims of India. And the call was very simple, and the plan is very simple, that you kill 2 million Muslims in India, just like you have done to Rohingya people, for instance, Myanmar has done to Rohingya people, so that the rest of 220 plus million Muslims in India basically would leave the country or would be exterminated, whatever the case scenario may be. And there are, of course, money that was being offered. There are the rewards being offered for anybody who is willing to take up arms to make it happen. So this is something, of course, when our Modi government has been complicit in, has been silent completely over this issue, has never ever, of course, said a word about. And all of this is a result of very well orchestrated, state-sponsored hate, Islamophobia against Muslims that starts with discriminatory citizenship policies, love jihad law, anti-conversion law, to anti beef and anti-halal law, essentially, to anything else basically that we have seen over the last few years, especially, that has resulted in persecution and othering of Muslims, including, for instance, the anti-hijab, basically the anti-hijab law, you might want to call it, or policy that, for instance, a southern state like Karnataka has placed over young Muslim women. And which means basically you cannot even participate, you cannot even do exams, and you cannot participate in schools if you're wearing if you're wearing hijab. And this is just a very simple and basic example of severe human rights violations that are happening in India, and the world is silent. And that's just Muslims I'm talking about. Look at Christians, look at Dalits. So many churches have been attacked over the last few years. Many Christian priests and Christians have been lynched as well, more specifically, or attacked under the pretext of anti-conversion law, for instance. And there's, it's not just state policy; it's the mobs now who are taking the law in their hands.
Really, really tragic. And what does the world do? They have the G20, I believe, this week, meeting in India. So that's a reward. And UAE gave him Modi an award of some kind, and they are met with warm embraces in Muslim majority countries. Very, very unfortunate. One of the parallels that I have in my own mind is the political directorate of Muslim countries for quite a number of years have applied themselves in such a manner to generate hate for common people, and yet still, because Islam is seen as a political system, as an ideology, not as a faith in that sense. And the politicians are not held to account, but rather the common folk who have absolutely no influence on their authoritarianism and on their absolutely inhumane rule. And many, many times they are victims to it. So there you have it. If the Muslims are doing it to the Muslims, what do you leave for the others? And that's why we have to more and more rely on whatever is left of the international conventions on human rights and the ability to be human, to exist in a safe place where you can actually struggle to exist in terms of the normal day-to-day struggles, the economy, raising a family, seeking happiness in this place. It's such a crazy time that we live in. Brother Taha, how can our viewers get a copy of this report to get actually the full details of it?
Well, thank you once again for this opportunity to share a little bit about this report. And yes, you can access this report by going to justiceforallcanada.org. And if you go to Resources tab, under Resources, you can find this under Reports specifically. So justiceforallcanada.org, and you go to Resources tab, and under Resources, you can find specifically the reports. It's also available on the homepage of the same website later towards the bottom of it. And if you want us to simply email it to you, please email us at info@justiceforallcanada.org, asking for the report on global Islamophobia and genocide. We would be happy to send you a copy of it, a virtual copy or soft copy of it. We can also mail it to you if needed. And we encourage you to use this report to share it with academics, with policymakers, with politicians, with MPs, with anybody who has influence in society who can do something about it. It would be very, very beneficial. So please do so. And this is just one report, and we have a bunch of other reports that are in works. So thank you for your cooperation and ensuring that it actually gets in the right hands.
And finally, in month of Ramadan, Muslims tend to be generous, but we tend to only look for religious type activities to donate and to support their work. How can our viewers in this blessed month of Ramadan help Justice for All Canada? I mean, their work is so absolutely needed, so absolutely necessary. How can they, is there mechanisms for them to financially support Justice for All Canada?
Well, thank you for that opportunity again. Justice for All's work is prophetic mission of establishing qist, establishing adl, establishing justice, fairness, and equity for Muslim minorities in particular, but anybody who is undergoing very, very challenging times. Our work specifically is zakat eligible under 3 categories of zakat. And it has been endorsed by Canadian Council of Imams as well, as far as zakat eligibility is concerned. So please ensure that this Ramadan, as you are supporting your masjid, as you're supporting your local relief or social service organization or any global relief organization, make sure that you set aside some sadaqah, some donation, some zakat for Muslim minorities who need to be defended, whose voice need to be heard, and who's for whom we are doing a life-saving work of establishing justice and holding perpetrators accountable. And to do all that, you can simply go to justiceforallcanada.org. Right there at the top, there is a donate button. Please do your bit to share whatever zakat or sadaqah you can this year for the most deserving people, to be honest, around the world, who don't even get our relief, that we actually send through relief organizations. These are people who are in concentration camps, who don't even get any relief, essentially, that you and I send through other organizations. These are the people we are fighting for. So please donate go to justiceforallcanada.org, and you can specifically go to donate button. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all your sadaqat and zakat this month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Taha, for the opportunity to really highlight these issues around the world of Muslim minorities and their suffering. And I pray to God that He grants them relief and grants your work tremendous success. Until we meet again, thank you again. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, and thank you, and Ramadan Mubarak to you all.
Ramadan Mubarak as well. Until next time, viewers, peace out.
Not in my name.